It may seem kind of obvious, but communication involves two things. It involves one animal making a signal and sending that signal, and another animal being able to receive that signal and interpret it. If an animal sends a signal and another animal doesn't know what's trying to be communicated, then this whole thing gets kind of derailed. The types of communication that I'm going to talk about are going to be pheromone communication, which is chemical communication, and we've seen that a little bit before, and communication by symbolic signals. So we'll talk about sounds, gestures, there can be colors in dances and things like that, and then lights like the fireflies. We'll talk about a couple of those. Let's talk about pheromones. And we've seen some pheromones in our termite lab, but pheromones can be used to communicate a lot of things. Remember, a pheromone is a chemical signal, and what has to happen is a pheromone is released by one member in the population, and it's received by other members in the population. Here's an example of an alarm pheromone. That's made by fish, and that signal is received by fish, and what they do is they kind of aggregate in one area. So why could these fish be alarmed? Maybe there's a predator or something at the surface of water, and that's causing them to aggregate more towards the bottom. If you do a search on nova and ant pheromones, you'll also find a really interesting video on that, so I'd highly recommend it. Another useful type of pheromone is sex pheromones, which can be deposited throughout the environment to communicate the reproductive status of individuals that live close by. So here you can see this big cat urinating on a tree, and that urine would contain pheromones that when another cat comes by, they can smell that and determine different information that's communicated by those pheromones. This picture, even though it's cut off, shows a male lion chasing down a female lion. So the initial communication would be a chemical one by sex pheromones, and then once the mate gets in proximity, then there would be additional communication with like different mating rituals. Some other interesting examples of pheromones are shown here. We've seen an example of a trailing pheromone with termites. A similar thing is shown here with ants following a trail. Here are some caterpillars that also use trailing pheromones, and in this experiment what you can see is that the rear end of a caterpillar was attached to a stick, and that stick was dragged along the ground, and that left a pheromone trail for other caterpillars to find. You can see here territorial and informational pheromones. Now if you think about it, you're all familiar with dogs going to the bathroom on fire hydrants, and cats actually scratch their face and pee on different upright surfaces to leave pheromones as well. But think about what information can be conveyed. So territorial information can be conveyed. So animals will kind of spray or mark things all around their territory. Just based on the height of the marking, that can give information about the size of the animal. The species of the animal can be conveyed, the reproductive status as we saw, or even the strength of the scent can be an indicator of how recently that animal was there. Now the last example I want to use is a very different one for pheromones. All the examples that I've talked about are how one member of a species communicates to another. But the example of a bolus spider is really cool. So they don't spin normal big webs like other spiders, but how they hunt is they use a little kind of like blob of silk called a bolus, and that's why they're called bolus spiders. And they make a chemical that's really similar to a mating pheromone of a moth. So they release this chemical pheromone, and the male moths will come near the bolus spider because they think it's a female that will be waiting for them. And in actuality, it's this bolus spider, and what they do is they kind of throw this sticky silk blob at that moth and hopefully catch it. So they're actually using chemical communication as a predatory strategy to fool moths. Another type of communication that I want to talk about is the dancing behavior of bees. And you can see some really cool YouTube videos at the bottom by linking here. So bees actually have a couple different types of dances that they do as diagrammed here. And what they can do with their dances indicate the distance and direction of a food source. So what they'll do if they go to a food source is they'll come in and they'll do a round dance. And in that round dance, they'll regurgitate some of the nectar that they found, just to let everybody know what the food source is. And then they'll do a dance called the waggle dance. Now, the waggle dance, the distance of the food source is communicated by the duration of the dance that they do. So this complete kind of figure 8 over here, that would indicate the distance, how long the dance is. And the direction is indicated by the angle of this part of the dance called the straight run. So you can see 3 different examples of waggle dances here. And in this case, the straight run goes straight up. And what that communicates to the bees in the hives is that the food source is straight toward the sun. Now in example number 2, the straight run, the bee is going straight down. And what that means is that the food source is directly away from the sun. In this final example, example number 3 over here, the bee waggles 30 degrees to the right of straight up and down. And what that means is that the food source is located 30 degrees to the right of straight to the sun. So this is really, really cool and well-studied behavior of bees. Check out those YouTube videos to find out more. We talked about how birds develop their songs, and a little bit of how they use them to communicate. Really, there's a lot of mating going on, letting other birds know that that's their territory. And since each species has its own type of song, they can be used for species identification. Insects can communicate by songs too, and typically insect songs are used for attracting mates. Now we talked about how birds can have innate and learned components to their songs, involving imprinting for some species as well. But for insects, there's going to be innate components to their song only. Can you guess why? Hopefully you're thinking it's because insects live a lot shorter than birds. And if you thought that, then you'd be right. Our next type of behavior is agonistic behaviors. And this is related to the next thing we'll talk about, which is dominance hierarchy. So what agonistic behaviors are is they're threatening or submissive rituals. And typically in here, it's not a fight till the death, and there's not too much harm usually done. What are they fighting for? Usually it's for some limiting resource, where the winner gets more of that resource, or maybe all of that resource, and the loser gets less or none. Now, the degree to which this is more ritualistic than actual combat will depend on how scarce the resource is and how likely that their resource will be available again. So an extreme example is that there's a species of squirrels, and the females are only receptive to mating for a couple of hours each year. So there's this really, really narrow window where the females will accept mates, and so a squirrel, it might only have one chance to pass on its genes for its whole life. So the ability to get mates is very, very crucial. So those male squirrels actually fight to the death sometimes, or leave each other severely, severely injured to get those mating rights. So the result of agonistic behavior is often dominance hierarchy, where there's a social ranking. There's a top alpha male, and then all of the males kind of fall in line below that. This is commonly referred to as a pecking order, which is a name for the dominance hierarchy in chickens. So you can think about this, and it's really obvious what the advantages are for the high-ranked individuals in the dominance hierarchy. They get more access to a lot of the resources, which are shown here. But actually, the lower-ranked animals can have a little bit of an advantage too. So, if they kind of know their place, they don't waste a whole lot of energy constantly establishing their place. It can happen sometimes, especially as the higher-ranked animals grow older or maybe have an injury or something like that. But by not having to constantly be fighting, the low-ranked individuals aren't going to waste energy or risk injuring themselves to keep their dominance hierarchy intact. But The bad thing that happens with the low-ranked individuals is if there are scarce resources and there's not enough to go around, a lot of times they'll have to leave the social group, and that leaves them subject to predation if they can't find another group or make it on their own. So initially, how a dominance hierarchy is established is there's a lot of fighting where an animal is more likely to get injured, and then they just kind of like do like threatening behaviors to each other. The next type of behavior that I want to talk about is cooperation, which obviously means working together. So in order for this to work, there has to be a very organized, structured society, and a lot of times this involves division of labor. So here's an example with African dogs, and they're bringing down a wildebeest. So African dogs can bring down prey the size of themselves or smaller pretty easily on their own. But to get bigger prey, they hunt in these packs. And you can imagine to do this, they need to be able to communicate and coordinate in a sophisticated way. And the African dogs, they're pretty interesting. Usually they're kind of nomadic or walk around a lot and like move around. And they'll hunt in packs to bring down the large prey. And how they divide up their labor is typically they'll have young at the time where prey is abundant, and they'll be kind of like babysitter dogs that are in charge of babysitting, and then the hunter dogs will go out and they'll bring in the prey, and they don't drag the prey back to wherever the pack is, but instead they'll regurgitate food to the babysitter dogs or to the young pups. Another example of cooperation are these pelicans here, and what they'll do when they hunt cooperatively is they'll herd the fish. So they'll get the fish kind of enclosed in a smaller area, and then eventually the fish will be in a very confined space, and they can eat them and catch them a lot easier. A cool example of cooperation that I came across were these Japanese honeybees. And what they're doing is they're completely surrounding a hornet, which is a lot bigger, and they're shaking to generate some heat. And that heat is going to kill this hornet, which could be very threatening to the hive. The last example of behavior that I want to talk about is altruism. And when we think of altruism, we might think about the human part of it, where you're giving to others. But in biology, it has a role too. Now, how we would define altruism is that it's going to reduce the fitness of the altruist kind of at face value. It's going to make that altruist more subject to death or predation or something like that. But it's going to increase the fitness of the recipient. So, at face value, this seems like it wouldn't be evolutionarily advantageous. But to figure out how it is, we need to look at this a little bit more in depth. Now, the classic example that's always cited as an example of altruistic behavior are these Belding's ground squirrels, and you can see some pictures of them here. Some other examples include bees, where the sterile workers, they can't even reproduce viable fertile offspring because they can't reproduce. There are only a select number of reproductives in the hive, and there's only one queen. The same is kind of true for these naked moles that live in underground burrows. So there are worker moles, and they don't reproduce at all. Instead, they find food for the queen and the king reproductives, and then the offspring. So they're kind of the feeders, not the breeders. And if something comes down into their burrow, they'll actually sacrifice themselves so that the reproductives aren't harmed. So to understand how this is beneficial, even for the altruist in this relationship, you need to understand a couple of new terms: inclusive fitness and kin selection. So we've described fitness as survival and producing viable fertile offspring, with the ultimate measure of fitness being how many viable fertile offspring an organism ends up making. Now, what's included in this definition of inclusive fitness is not only producing viable fertile offspring, but having close relatives produce viable fertile offspring too. And how does that result in fitness for the altruist? Well, the viable fertile offspring of close relatives are going to be sharing some genes with the altruist. And that's why it's beneficial to only do these behaviors for very close relatives. The closer the relative, the better. Now this brings us to the concept of kin selection. So kin selection just talks about that altruistic behavior, that aid that's being provided so that the close relatives can produce more offspring. So how likely is an animal to do altruistic behavior? Well, it kind of depends. One of those things that depends on is what's the benefit to the recipient of the altruistic behavior, what's the cost to the altruist, and how closely related are they? So let's think about this example. Would a young Belding's ground squirrel be more likely to help its grandparent, or would the grandparent one be more likely to help the young? Well, if the grandparent was helping the young, the grandparent might not be able to make too much more offspring themselves. But the young ground squirrel can make a whole bunch of offspring, maybe have their whole reproductive life ahead of them. But if it was flipped, if a young ground squirrel was helping a grandparent, it's not going to increase its fitness by inclusive fitness. Another thing that comes into play is relatedness. And there's a famous quote by a biologist called J.B.S. Haldane. And he famously said, I would lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. And the reason that's funny is we could all picture ourselves kind of sacrificing ourselves for a sibling. But Haldane's joke said that if 2 brothers survived, then they'd be kind of his equivalent in terms of fitness and being able to pass down his genes, or 8 cousins would have similar fitness in terms of passing down his genes. So when we talk about fitness, remember to think about inclusive fitness. Our traditional definition of fitness just talked about how many offspring that were viable and fertile were made by each individual, but with inclusive fitness, it says regardless of who's passing down the genes, as long as some of your genes are being passed down, that's going to increase your fitness. This is it for the 2 videos about behavior. I hope they were helpful.